let's talk a little bit about counter-arguments. Now, you may not need to include these in your cases for the speech that you're working on or in other speeches that you give. But I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about when should you build in a counter-argument into your persuasive speech. Well, like in most things, it depends on the topic and the target audience. So in this segment, we're going to think about the audience and whether or not a counter-argument is necessary or would be beneficial to your speech. So we can take a look at this chart, and when thinking about your topic and thinking about your audience, you want to identify, well, where are they? How close are they to your opinion? Because a lot of your decisions are going to be hinging upon that. If your audience is very supportive of your position, well, that's going to change your strategy. If the audience is neutral, that's going to change your strategy. If they're strongly opposed to your position, you got to rethink what you're going to do. So I kind of want to walk through each one of these very broad types of audience in terms of whether or not a counter-argument is necessary. So what are some of the potential audiences for your persuasive speeches? Well, there are people who agree with you. Okay, so if you're speaking in front of a very friendly audience and you're just trying to motivate them to take action, well, there's no real need for counter-arguments. Now, you could very easily use counter-arguments as a way of rallying support, of building energy by saying, well, here's why they are opposed to us, but here's our response to that. But in terms of persuading that friendly audience, you probably don't need counter-arguments. They're not essential to your persuasive goal. Strategically, stylistically, they might be useful, but they're probably not essential. Then we get to maybe people who don't know about your topic. Well, are counter-arguments necessary here? Possibly. Depends on the topic. If the ill is pretty clear, you probably don't need counter-arguments there as a way of being successful in your persuasive case. So, for example, no one's really confused about whether or not they should be opposed to, in favor of ending child hunger or opposed to sex slavery. No one's sitting there going, child hunger, before I render a judgment, I would like to hear the principled defense. No one's doing that. So if it's a really clear ill, you probably don't need those counter-arguments as part of the persuasive package. Now, if the ill is a little bit not as easily understood, then maybe here you do need that counter-argument. So let's say you're advocating for some little-known issue, and you can, in your mind's eye, picture that target audience immediately questioning the value of your proposal. Then you had better build in, as part of the persuasive package, the counter-argument. So here's a specific example of this. I've mentioned a couple of times, not too long ago, here in Washington State, we legalized marijuana. And there were people who were opposed to the legalization of marijuana that were in favor of marijuana. So medical marijuana, there was a small group of medical marijuana people who were opposed to general legalization of marijuana in Washington State. So when they were speaking to their constituency, when they were speaking to their supporters, they had to immediately provide counter-arguments as to why legalizing pot, why this particular bill for legalizing pot was bad. So they knew that their audience, which knew something about the topic but maybe didn't know it deeply, would immediately hear the case and begin to ask questions. So these people who are in favor of marijuana but opposed to this bill had to develop an argument for those in favor of marijuana that immediately addressed their counter-arguments or their counter-concerns. So then we shift over to maybe people who disagree with you. Well, without a doubt, you're probably going to want to use counter-arguments here. And we'll return to this later next week in terms of how you're performing your ethos in this speech. But the counter-argument here is trying to win support. So you can't simply be a jerk, right? You can't spend 10 to 15 minutes talking about why everybody who disagrees with you is totally wrong and a little stupid and hope that they're going to be persuaded by that, right? No one wants to listen to that sort of beating up on their position. So then we finally get to the far end here, and people who probably will never agree with you. Do you need to include counter-arguments there? Well, I don't know, but probably. I can think of many cases where you would. And you're not really hoping for persuasion here, right? You're just hoping to demonstrate that your position is valid. Even if it's not persuasive to them, it's at least a valid position that someone might hold. So you're doing some persuasive work, but you're not aiming at total conversion. So if we return to this chart and we're thinking about, well, what can you hope to accomplish for that audience? If you're softening opposition, you're probably going to want to include counter-arguments because they don't agree with you initially, so you want to address their concerns. Generally, we want to meet the audience where they are with the arguments that we have. If you're strengthening support, well, maybe. It depends on the topic. If you're motivating action, again, maybe or maybe not. Depends on strategically what those counter-arguments will do for you with that audience. And I do wish I could be more definitive here, but as with most speech subjects, it totally depends, and you need to render a judgment. So keep in mind, if we look at that chart or if we think on that chart, true persuasion is exceptionally complex and situational. And you need to think carefully about what you can accomplish in the time that you have for the audience that you have, and therefore what you should attempt to do. So many years ago, I was teaching the persuasive speech here at the University of Washington, and I had this student come up afterwards, and he was thinking about topics and what he should try to do and whether or not he should have counter-arguments. And I said, well, what are you speaking on? And he said, well, what I'd like to do, and I should point out the student had no shortage of self-confidence. One time, this particular student came into class drunk, wearing a gigantic sombrero. That was a joy. That was a joy for me and for everyone involved. Nevertheless, so this student came in and I said, well, what do you want to work on? And he says, well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to argue that all religions in the world should be banned. I'm like, well, let's see where this one's running. Do tell why. And he said, well, the fact of the matter is I'm pretty good at persuasion, and I worry that if I'm not setting a high bar, the speech is going to be boring for me. And all I could think was, wow, you've persuaded me that you're an ass. Congratulations! But so what he was hoping to do is total conversion in the span of 10 minutes. That's probably not going to happen. Most persuasion is incremental. So if you're meeting an audience that's opposed to it, you're probably hoping to move them slightly along that slider, get them a little less opposed to you. Odds are somebody's not hearing the speech, dead set opposed to you, and at the end of 5 minutes, hallelujah, the scales have fallen from my eyes and you are speaking the true word. That's probably not happening in this time frame on these types of speeches. So in the next lecture, we'll look at tracking down these areas that you want to speak to with counter-arguments. This lecture was more about thinking through whether or not you should have counter-arguments, and the next lecture we'll look at, well, if you need those counter-arguments, where should you be speaking to them? What are the counter-arguments? What are the issues that you need to address?